Morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I was happy when Larry and I spoke. He asked if I would introduce Rachel. I'm happy to do so, but it's going to be quick. I work here in our Women's Center, and in that context, I get to hear all the time from students. And one thing I frequently hear is how wonderful Rachel is as an instructor, an incredibly responsive academic advisor. I think for those of us who haven't had the opportunity to take a class with you, Rachel, this is such a wonderful opportunity to really know what our instructors are passionate about, what they really like to academically research. And I think that this topic today of marriage, altered states, the meaning of marriage in the US, for all of us, it's something that can be researched or felt personally. We all have ideas about it. But Rachel's going to give us a lot of information from the academic side of things about how that institution is impacting all of us and how it's changing. So some of you who have been here for a while know that Rachel has taught here in Gender and Women's Studies since 1999. Wow, flashback. There are programs here. Hope all of you picked those up. There's a more detailed description of Rachel's prior work that we hope you'll take a look at. Rachel's taught gender and women's studies. She's done a lot of work prior to that with Seattle Rape Relief. So has just done a lot of work in terms of connecting with students about deeply personal issues. So with that in mind, again with the program, just a little side note is that there's a questionnaire form. So as you're thinking about things, as her presentation goes on, you can maybe jot those down for questions. And then there is also a feedback survey at the end that we hope you'll take time to complete. So we're going to turn it over to Rachel. So thank you. Round of applause.
Thank you for that introduction, and to the Global Affairs Center for arranging this. When Larry asked me whether I wanted to speak for the Global Affairs Center, I was like, well, most of my research and interest is really in the US and US culture. And he said, do you make any connections to the rest of the world? And I was like, well, yeah, a little bit. He's like, that's fine. So here I am. I started my interest in this topic recently and doing a lot of research on marriage when I read the 2010 Pew report, which was entitled The Decline of Marriage and Rise of New Families. And the primary finding of that report was that the rates of marriage have been going down steadily and fairly steeply since 1960. So you can see here that in 1960, 72% of adults were married. And in 2008, only 52% of adults in the United States were married. So it's been quite a steep drop. And at the same time, particularly for the last decade of this, there's been a population in the United States fighting really hard for the right to be included in this institution. And I thought that was kind of an interesting contradiction. I was like, what's going on here? So I started looking, that represents that population. So I started looking at the trends and some of the data on marriage, and I noticed there were kind of a lot of contradictions going on. 40% of Americans, according to that Pew report, sorry, I have to turn my head, and apparently the mic is going on. 40% of Americans say that marriage is obsolete. That's a pretty big number, but 67% of those same people polled are optimistic about the future of marriage. And only 5% of people under 30 do not want to get married. So we think it's obsolete, but we're optimistic about it and we want to do it. The US also has one of the highest marriage rates in the West, despite the decline, but also one of the highest divorce rates. So we like marriage a lot, but we're not very good at it. So before learning of these contradictions that are revealed in some of the newer data, I had my own relationship to the institution of marriage. I wasn't a child who played bride or imagined what my wedding was going to be like when I was a little kid. I was a child of divorce. My parents got divorced in 1980 at the peak of this trend, so I'm a trend, I guess. And I had shifting ideas about marriage and sort of my desire to be a part of it in my adult years. and was pretty firmly on the fence of not wanting to engage in the institution of marriage, particularly when it excluded many of my friends and loved ones. But my current husband really wanted to do it. And if any of you have been married, you know it's a lot about compromise. So I compromised, and we got legally married, and it's working out so far. In terms of my academic background, I have a law degree, and so I studied the legal aspects of marriage quite a bit when I was in law school. And then gender studies is very interested in relationships that involve gender dynamics, and so I've studied a lot about that, particularly in the context of a class that I teach with two of my colleagues who are sitting in the audience, who will wave graciously, Diana Knopf and Brooke Simmers. So we teach this interdisciplinary class, it's 15 credits, and it's human sexuality, communication studies, and gender studies mixed together, and I'll talk more about that at the end of this talk, because you're all going to want to take it. So kind of to make sense of these contradictions, I started looking at a little bit of history and cross-cultural information about the institution of marriage and how it's differed through space and time. Most of you probably know that marriage hasn't always looked like this. The cleavers don't necessarily represent even the way marriage looked at the time that this show was happening, let alone any other time and place in the world. The idea that marriage is a contract between two adults who freely choose each other based on love and sexual attraction and pledge monogamy to each other for the rest of their lives is rare throughout human history and geography. Stephanie Coontz, in her book, Marriage: A History, documents some of these differences in the way marriage has been viewed. Love throughout human history has rarely been considered necessary or even desirable in a marriage. Most societies throughout human history have prioritized relationships with extended family, community, or God over relationships between spouses. And strong relationships between spouses could threaten those other relationships, and so those strong relationships were actually discouraged. In many cultures, monogamy has not been an ideal of marriage. Eskimo couples traditionally had co-spousal arrangements where there would be two couples and they would have sexual relationships with the spouse of the opposite sex, the other person's spouse of the opposite sex. And even today in Tibet and parts of India and Nepal, a woman may be married to 2 or more brothers. This is a woman who's married to 5 brothers. I have no context for this photo, but they look pretty happy to me. In ancient China, a woman might bring a sister or more than one sister to her husband's home as backup wives. And Bari women in Venezuela were expected to take lovers during pregnancy, when the understanding of the biological inputs into the child was that any man who had sex with her while she was pregnant would be contributing biologically to that child. So when she gave birth, she would list all the men that she'd slept with during her pregnancy, and they would all be told, you have a child. And then they were expected to care for that child and provide for them during their lifetime. The husband did not object, and obviously this increased that child's likelihood of survival. We now mostly draw from Western and Judeo-Christian ideas of marriage, but of course, even within that context, the institution has changed greatly over time. Polygamy was widely accepted from the ancient Hebrews until the 19th century in the United States with Mormons. And in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, adultery became idealized as the highest form of love among the aristocracy. As one noble woman put it, it's impossible for true love to exert its powers between two people who are married to each other. So you could really only truly love somebody if you weren't married to them. For most of human history, marriage has functioned as a property arrangement to strengthen kinship ties between groups. So one chose a partner who would help them survive, help them raise their children, contribute to the family business. And it was obvious to everyone involved that young people with very little life experience wouldn't make very good decisions based on those factors. And so parents or older relatives generally chose one spouse. Love might come later, but that was frosting on the cake, so to speak, and not the main purpose of the union. Thank you for getting my pun, Diana. And we still see the legacy of property as marriage as a property arrangement in the fact that most brides in the United States still take their husband's name, sometimes even their husband's first and last name. And the ceremony, where the groom stands at the front of the room and the father gives the bride away, delivering her to the groom. And in a strange twist, arranged marriage has made a bit of a comeback with The Bachelor and The Bachelorette series that have had several seasons on television. In this show, usually a man, but in some versions a woman, is presented with 25 or so eligible partners, gets to know them, and then picks one, hopefully, with the goal of marriage. Instead of parents choosing a spouse for a loved and cherished child, now TV producers will arrange your match for you. Not surprisingly, although there have been many proposals as a result of this show, only 2 of the 28 versions have resulted in people who married the person they chose on the show. That's a 7% success rate, so I would not put your fate in the hands of TV producers if I were you. So, The Bachelor aside, what is marriage now? For people who become legally married in the United States, they enter into a legal contract that results in many hundreds of benefits and legal responsibilities. But I don't think that's what marriage really means to most people. I think it's more about a promise of love and commitment, tradition, and the basis for a family. According to the Pew Report, Americans say that a very important reason to get married, the top 5 answers were love, lifelong commitment, companionship, having children, and financial stability. So I'm going to kind of go through these 5 and talk about a little of the data and interesting information about each one. Starting with love. And it's almost Valentine's Day, so that's nice. 93% of married people and 91% of unmarried people said love was a very important reason to get married. And I'm assuming they mean romantic and sexual love when they say love in general. So I'm always curious about how we construct ideas like love in our culture. Aristotle said love is composed of a single soul inhabiting 2 bodies. So when you really love somebody in this way, you almost merge into one person. And then some famous adages about love. Elevate it. All you need is love. Love conquers all. Love is blind. Love makes the world go round. So love is everything in terms of these adages. According to Stephanie Kuntz, in the US, we're in an era of, quote, expressive marriage, where the institution becomes a source of self-esteem and personal growth for people who enter into it. So a marriage based on love should make me a better person and make me feel better about myself. You hear a lot of me in there. I hear a lot of me in there. But we're expected to love our spouse above all others, put them first, and be sexually faithful to them. So our spouse becomes the person who meets all of our sexual needs and most, if not all, of our emotional needs. Is this realistic? I wonder, if we elevate love to this status, if it becomes realistic that it can flourish when you're contending with piles of bills and dirty laundry and unruly nose hair and all the other weird things that can happen when you're with someone for a long time. We know that it can. This is a couple who's been married for 70 years. But there's no cookie cutter marriage, and it definitely takes work and humor. There's some research to suggest that the more we lie to ourselves about our partner's flaws, the more likely we are to have a happy marriage. And I think this slide represents that pretty well. So what about commitment? 87% of married people and 74% of unmarried people said commitment was a very important reason to get married, which I find a little bit ironic considering our high divorce rate. This seems to be, to me, a desire for stability. And I want to tell a little story. A good friend of mine was wanting to make a lifetime commitment to her partner, and they were heterosexual, but she didn't want to enter into a legal marriage. She decided to have a commitment ceremony. And when she was explaining it to me, she said, I just want to wake up next to this person every day and choose them, and not feel like I'm there because of some obligation or some promise I made, but because I'm waking up and deciding to choose them again every single day. And I thought that was kind of beautiful. And I told my partner at the time, who we weren't married yet, and he said, that's my worst nightmare. Like, I just want to make that decision one time and be done with it, and then I can think about other things. So I got that. But so this seems to be about a feeling of kind of predictability, stability. You don't want to have to make that choice over and over again. You want to know who that person's going to be there in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever. But this commitment, at least lifelong commitment, eludes most of us. So the research on commitment, I think, can be kind of illustrative. Yeah, so this is, the Gottman Institute is a Seattle-based relationship research institute run by John Gottman and his collaborators, including his wife Julie. And I'm just going to give you a little taste of their research. I don't have time to go too much in depth into it, but if you're interested, check them out. They do amazing stuff. They have 30 years of longitudinal data and a 90% accuracy of predicting whether a marriage will last. Sometimes just by watching a couple interact for a few minutes, they can predict whether that relationship's going to last. They use both qualitative and quantitative data. So what did they find about commitment? 50% of all divorces occur within the first 7 years of marriage, and most of them, according to the Gottmans, occurs because of a negative communication climate. So the four sort of triggers or markers of a negative communication climate are criticism, especially when women do it, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling, especially when men do it. So it used to be thought that anger was the toxic element in relationships, and that was really what, if people were angry at each other a lot of the time, that's what would doom a marriage. The Gottmans actually found that there wasn't much difference in terms of how successful couples and non-successful couples, how much anger there was. It was the negativity, the negative atmosphere in the relationship. And so these behaviors often escalate the negativity between the couple, and it's hard to sort of get out of that spiral. The second high-risk period in marriage, if you make it through the first 7 years, I just had my 7-year anniversary in December, and I made it, is the 16 to 20 years into the marriage. And the primary trigger for that is not a negative emotional climate, but a lack of positivity. So couples who divorced at the 16 to 20 year mark were typically ones who just sort of weren't very interested in each other anymore. They didn't have a lot of passion for each other and what the other person was doing, and things had just sort of fizzled out. So there are a lot of, the good news is the Gottmans have developed a lot of techniques for turning relationships around that are exhibiting some of these patterns. And if you want to know more about that, you either have to go to them or take Intersections, which I'll tell you more about later. So companionship was the third most common reason people stated as a very important reason for getting married. We now want our spouses to be, we expect them to be not only sexual partners, but our best friends. And married people are less likely to be in touch with friends, neighbors, parents, and siblings than unmarried people. We want, and we've come to sort of expect that our spouse is going to know us deeply and intimately, maybe even be able to read our mind. And you've probably had this conversation with people, right, where they say, I'm so mad at my partner because they didn't understand this thing about me, and you go, did you tell them? No, they should just know, right? We often have this expectation. But people now are actually investing less time in their relationships, especially their marital relationships. In 1975, couples with children spent 13 hours a week alone with each other, and now couples with children spend 9 hours a week alone with each other. Couples without children spent 35 hours a week together in 1975, and now it's 26 hours a week. So along with the marriage rate decline, married people are also spending less time with each other. And mostly this is due to the fact that we spend more time at work and engage in more intensive parenting than we used to. So whether these trends are avoidable or not is one question that I'm interested in. I'll talk a little bit more about some of that later, but one issue is parental leave. If we ameliorated the work-life, or the work-children balance for people, then we might gain a little bit of that time back, right? And so this shows the United States with 0 weeks of paid parental leave compared to many other countries around the world, including China with 90 days, India with 84 days, Mexico with 84 days, and the UK with 280 days. Which brings us to reason number 4 that people said was an important reason to get married: children. Richard Reeves of the Center on Children and Families believes there are 3 types of marriage. The traditional marriage where the husband was the breadwinner and the wife was the homemaker. Romantic marriage, DINK stands for double income, no kids. So these are people who have highly developed independent identities, but spend a lot of time together. Romantically, they're very intertwined and emotionally interdependent. And HIPS, high investment parenting, in which both couples think it's their shared responsibility to take care of children, the home, and also earn the money. One of the other findings of the Pew Report is that marriage is declining among all groups, but persisting most among the most affluent and educated Americans. So those people tend to delay marriage until they've established careers, finished their education, take time to select a partner, and engage in romantic marriage for a couple of years before having kids, which creates some resilience for those trying infant and toddler years. All parents, this is the inverse of the companionship slide or information, all parents today spend more time with their children than they did 30 years ago. So this shows in 1965, mothers spent 8 hours a week on paid work on average, 32 hours a week on housework, and 10 hours a week on childcare. And fathers spent 42 hours a week on paid work, 4 hours a week on housework, and 2.5 hours a week on childcare. And you can see the childcare bar for both groups has increased. And that's kind of reflecting the HIP, high investment parenting model of marriage that's increasing. But there's, as I said, marriage is persisting most among affluent and educated Americans, and that applies to this too. In the 1970s, college-educated and non-educated families spent about roughly equal amounts with their children. But now, fathers with college degrees spend twice as much time with their children as the least educated fathers. And perhaps all this time with children is overdoing it for some couples. You've probably heard the term helicopter parenting, where parents hover around their children, making sure nothing bad happens to them and they never experience a bad feeling. And some of us have experiences with young people where we kind of wonder if that's doing them any favors or not. But we do know that engaging and talking to children, reading to them, engaging in physical activities with them, cooking and eating meals together increases educational outcomes, health outcomes, and set long-term habits for success and happiness. So it's definitely doing some good. But if we go back to those 3 different types of marriage, the people who are most likely to get married and stay married are not engaging in that traditional model anymore. In fact, the women getting and staying married today are the most economically independent women in our society and perhaps in US history. So they're committing not because they need a man to support them, but because they're committing to a team to support high levels of parental investment in their children. So some couples are focusing on children as a reason to get married, and 3/4 of Americans say that raising kids is best done by married people. But 41% of babies born in 2008 were born to single mothers. Before you jump to conclusions about single mothers having casual encounters, 80% of those mothers were living or romantically involved with the father at the time. And most of those thought that they would marry the father. Obviously, that's not what happened. I'm always struck by the way that we talk about single mothers. I had a student once come to my office to talk about welfare moms, as he put it, and he was really concerned about women who had a lot of children and then relied on public assistance to support their families. And he kept saying, these women keep getting themselves pregnant. And I kept saying, that's not how it happens. There's another human involved. But we often talk about this as if there's only one adult involved in creating this situation, right? So let's rewrite this. In 2008, 41% of babies were born to single parents, and 80% of those parents were living together or romantically involved. That feels really different to me. So next time you hear someone talk about single mothers, just like rewrite the sentence for them. There's another adult involved. But children raised by two parents are in fact less likely to have behavior problems, health problems, hunger. They're likely to get better grades and have higher income mobility as adults. However, many researchers believe that the issue here is not the singleness of the parent, but the poverty in which they are much more likely to live if they are a single parent. 1 in 8 children with 2 married parents lives in poverty, and 1 in 2 children with a single mother. Which brings us to financial stability as the 5th most common reason people said was a very important reason to get married. Only 31% of married people and 30% of unmarried people said this was a very important reason to get married. That's a minority of Americans, but it still was the 5th most common reason. And it did bring me to look at another very striking finding of the Pew report, which was that while marriage declined among all groups, it declined most steeply among low-income groups. So using educational attainment as a correlate for economic status, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. You can see that marriage is going down for all of these groups, but for those with a high school degree or less, 72% of adults with a high school degree or less were married in 1960, and today it's 48%. So that's the steepest drop. To throw some more statistics at you, if we divide the population of the country up into fifths based on their incomes, the top income quintile, the 20% of Americans who make the most money, 79% of them are married, and the bottom quintile, 18% of them are married. So looking at it the other way around, household income of married adults is 41% higher than that of unmarried adults. That's household income. Married adults are more likely to have 2 incomes, but the difference between married adults and unmarried adults in 1960 was only 12%. So that gap is growing significantly. So one cause of the gap that we're looking at here with what I'm going to call the marriage gap, the fact that marriage is declining much more steeply for lower income groups, is gender equality. More women are participating in the labor market. Women are participating at almost equal rates with men now, and are much more likely to get higher education and participate in the knowledge economy and professional jobs than they did in 1960. And more people today marry within their same income bracket. So as one researcher somewhat crudely put it, in 1960, male doctors married female nurses, and then those nurses often stopped working. Today, male doctors marry female doctors. Then they pool the resources of both of those kind of high-powered jobs. And most people think this is a fairly good thing overall. In 1977, 48% of Americans thought that marriages work better when both the husband and wife have jobs and take care of the children. I was kind of surprised by that, half of people back in 1977. But in 2010, it was 62% of Americans who thought that marriage works better when both work and take care of the home. And if you look at people under 30, it goes up to 72%. So this combination of people who have similar incomes and status equalizes power and resources within a marriage. Women are much more likely to enter a marriage with status, income, identities, that are much more similar to their husbands than they were several decades ago. But this kind of egalitarian marriage is more complicated than the traditional marriage where gender determined much of the roles and responsibilities within a relationship. Someone did certain things because they were a woman, and someone did certain things because they were a man. Now, instead, all of those things have to be negotiated. Roles and expectations have to be processed and talked about. And that takes skills that may correlate with higher education, as well as having more time and energy to bring to your relationship. That would also correlate with higher income groups. These communication skills that are now probably more necessary to make a relationship and a marriage successful, I fear are declining also somewhat because of our technology, social media, and the fact that some people communicate through mediums that only allow them 140 characters. This happens. So another cause of this marriage gap is the changing economy, which amplifies some of these differences. The income gap, as I'm sure you all know, has widened significantly during the time period that we're talking about. And stable living wage jobs for folks in the bottom income brackets have been disappearing. And the Pew survey found that people with fewer economic resources place a higher premium on being financially stable before they get married. So they're waiting and delaying marriage until they become financially stable, but they're not waiting to move in with each other or to have children. Life continues to happen, but that marriage step is they're putting off until they're financially stable. Furthermore, the poor find it harder to stay married. Divorce rates are much higher. The stress of poverty is hard on a marriage and a relationship. And a confusion about this correlation between marriage rates being lower and divorce rates being higher among the poor has led some policymakers to call for marriage as a solution to poverty. In the 90s, President Clinton's welfare overhaul allowed states to spend federal funds on marriage promotion as a way of getting people off the welfare rolls. And in 2014, Marco Rubio gave a speech calling marriage the greatest tool to lift children and families out of poverty. So if poor people would just get married, everything would be fine. Can the government help bolster marriage amongst the poor? The answer is yes, but not by promoting marriage, which is what they've been trying to do. Most of those programs have been a colossal waste of taxpayer money. And the reason is that many poor women make very rational decisions not to get married. It's not that they've never heard of it, and if you just tell them that marriage is a good thing, they'll suddenly go, oh yeah. Many say that if they married the father of their children, that would bring more financial and other kinds of instability into their home. They risk accumulating debt, an unstable work history of the partner, perhaps criminal activity. Some face steep tax penalties if they marry and are working. And at least one study found that single mothers who married and then divorced were worse off than those who never marry. So if you're aware of the high divorce rates, then why take that risk? Custody laws also may play a role in some people's choices. Before the 1970s, when custody was contested in a divorce, when both parents wanted custody of the children, the man almost always got it. But custody laws have changed now, and most states favor shared custody when both parents want custody. Women initiate 2/3 of divorces, but that number goes down in states that give fathers a lot of rights in terms of their children. So when women know that they're likely to lose time with their kids, then they're less likely to divorce the father of their children. And the more money a father has, the more likely he is going to end up with shared custody. For an unmarried woman, with children, if she wants to end the relationship with the father of those children, she doesn't need to involve the courts. She doesn't need to spend all that money and potentially worry about what the court's ruling is going to be. She can end the relationship on her own, and then if that father wants to be involved with his children, he's the one who has to go to court, pay the filing fee, and initiate the whole proceeding. So poor women who want to ensure continuous custody of their children actually have more rights and a better chance of doing so if they don't marry the father of their children. So it's pretty clear that marriage is not going to solve poverty, but addressing poverty and income inequality will likely lead to higher rates of marriage and longer marriages. We also need to expand our definition of family to include new realities about how people are living their lives. The Pew Report asked people how they define a family, what is a family? And the vast majority of people say that a married couple with children is a family, a married couple without children is a family, a single parent with children is a family, and an unmarried couple with children is a family. Fewer people say same-sex couples with children are family, but still a majority. But a minority of Americans say a same-sex couple without children and an unmarried couple without children are a family. So what makes you a family basically is either being married or having children together. But the Pew Report didn't even ask about other relationships of care and responsibility that are becoming more the norm. Step-parents and stepchildren, grandparents caring for grandchildren, the partners of biological parents, networks of friends and roommates whose lives are intertwined and interdependent. Stephanie Kuntz says that when we expect responsible behavior outside as well as inside marriage, we actually reduce the temptation to evade or escape marriage. So that is, if we expect people to take care of each other whether they're married or not, people are going to get married more. And I believe this is particularly necessary for involving non-married fathers in their children's lives, who spend less time with and give less financial support to their children when the mother has remarried or repartnered. And I think this is due to the lack of sort of support and acknowledgement of fatherhood in general, as well as a lack of value placed on networks of love and support that don't look like the Cleavers. So in order to promote marriage, if that is indeed a goal that we want, we need to make poor men more appealing as spouses to poor women, as to put it crudely, which means we need to end the war on drugs, defeat the prison industrial complex, eradicate racism from the criminal justice system, reinvigorate unions, bring back living wage jobs, narrow the income gap, and much more. But in next month, well, yeah. But all of that is slightly beyond the scope of this talk. So to get back to marriage, does understanding the reasons people say people should get married help us understand the meaning of marriage? And maybe it gets us a little bit closer. Hopefully now you have a somewhat deeper understanding, but we can have all of these 5 things without getting married. Today in the United States, we can certainly have a loving sexual relationship with somebody without marrying them. We can make lifelong commitments without getting married. We can have companionship. Obviously, we can have children, and financial stability is now achievable for both sexes without the institution of marriage. So why do people still do it? There's one reason that the Pew Report didn't ask about and didn't identify that I think is definitely a reason: weddings. I really think some people get married for the wedding. And you know, weddings are really great. You find this perfect location, gather your loved ones, get lots of presents, find the perfect outfit. I have no idea what that is, but I had to put it on there. And the average wedding today costs almost $30,000. Weddings are a $49 billion industry. So it's no wonder that we're convinced that we should do it, right? And almost from birth, little girls, mostly just girls, are encouraged to dream about their perfect wedding day, plan it down to the last detail, except of course to actually think about who they might marry, because that would be weird when they're 5, but like planning their wedding isn't. And preparing for the actual marriage by developing, communication skills, that's not really necessary. Girls are bombarded with toys, games, books, even little wedding gowns to dress up in. And of course, this onslaught doesn't stop when we reach adulthood. Weddings become an excuse to splurge, to indulge in luxuries that one would never allow themselves to do otherwise. And especially for women, for once focusing on themselves, getting exactly what they want, regardless of what anybody else thinks, is socially sanctioned and even encouraged. So it is no wonder to me then that we get the bridezilla phenomenon. Girls put so much thought and planning into a few hours of their lives that it's really not surprising that they go a little crazy over the details. There's incredible pressure to get it absolutely perfect. And there's a power dynamic that goes on here too, which I find is interesting and didn't really realize until it happened to me. Until women have children, they really experience power greater than men only in the sphere of weddings. As an example, I owned my own house long before I was married. And one day, my male partner was over at my house. He didn't live there, and the washer dryer was being delivered. And the delivery man would only talk to my partner. And my partner kept saying, I don't live here. I don't have anything to do with this. You know, talk to her. She owns the house, whatever. And the guy couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. And that kind of thing happens to women all the time, where their voices, their roles, their ownership of something is disregarded, right? But when I was planning my wedding, complete opposite. Every encounter I had, I was assumed to be the expert. I was assumed to know exactly what I wanted. And it was assumed that if my partner and I disagreed, that I would win, because I was the woman. So why bother talking to him about any of it, right? So we get married for lots of reasons, but there's no denying that marriage has cultural significance that other relationships do not. When I got engaged, I was really surprised by the response of other people to the announcement. And for example, I had almost total strangers scream when I told them I was engaged and hug me. And I was like, I don't know you, why are you? Nobody ever reacted like that when I moved in with a partner. When I got a tenure track job at a community college, that didn't inspire the same joy of total strangers in what was happening in my life. And many same-sex couples who would like to get married but can't, in the past particularly, have expressed that their relationships just aren't treated with the same weight and significance that married relationships are. I've heard so many stories about people who had a commitment ceremony, and the photographs of that ceremony were not on the piano next to their brothers and sisters' wedding photos, right? So little things like that just remind them that's not real. The fight over same-sex marriage in this country for the last couple decades illustrates the significance of the institution of marriage, both to those fighting for inclusion and those fighting against it. In 1990, 3 couples sued the state of Hawaii, questioning whether the denial of marriage licenses to homosexual couples amounted to discrimination. And based on the decisions that were coming out of the Hawaii courts, it looked like Hawaii was going to become the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. As the case progressed, 30 states passed legislation banning gay marriage. So the red, maroon, and black states are all ones that passed amendments or laws that banned same-sex marriage, civil unions, and any marriage-like contract in the black states between same-sex couples. So there was this sort of a countrywide panic, same-sex marriages are going to become legal, we better prevent that from happening. And then, of course, the Defense of Marriage Act passed at the federal level in 1996. But the tide has turned. In 2004, Massachusetts became the first state to allow gay marriage, and now 36 states and the District of Columbia allow same-sex marriage, and the federal government recognizes these relationships. When this whole process started, I used to tell my students, and we had, 2004, and then a couple of other states legalized gay marriage, and then there was sort of a pause, and all these states were passing bans, and I used to tell my students, I really think this country is going to see same-sex marriage in my lifetime. And now it's it's going to be in the decade, And Dan Savage came to speak at Shoreline Community College once, and he said, same-sex marriage will be legalized in the United States, but we'll be the last in the world to do it. So I'm happy that we're proving him wrong. So, what is the future of marriage? I don't know. But I do have some thoughts about it. I do think that marriage needs to become both more and less than it currently is. It needs to be more important than the wedding. Couples need to plan for a life and not a day. And marriages are more likely to succeed if the spouses know themselves and each other well. And it needs to be accessible to anyone who wants to participate. Married people are healthier, happier, and live longer than unmarried people, and from that perspective, it's clear that it is a human right. But marriage also needs to be less important in that other family arrangements need to be given the same weight and significance in our culture. More unmarried couples will also be healthier and happier if we afford their relationships and milestones with dignity, respect, and joy. And we'll have stronger communities and healthier children if we recognize that not all families look the same. That's all. So, thank you. Before I turn it over for questions, I have to do one more plug. Now that I've whetted your appetites and you all want to take this class, Intersections is a 15-credit class that's offered next quarter that explores issues of sexuality, relationships, power, gender, and communication. We have some handouts that Diana and Brooke will wave at people, so if you would like a little card to remind you of the dates and times, please take one from them. And with that shameless plug, I will end.
There was no mention of the religious implications of marriage. Obviously, that was deliberate since it's your talk, but that's a great big piece of it, at least in this country, as far as the divide between people who are willing to accept same-sex marriage, particularly, and not. Do you have any comments about that?
It was interesting to me that the Pew Report didn't turn up any, that people didn't say that was one of the most important reasons. I think that, yeah, that there are people for whom religious principles are part of what leads them to choose to enter into a marriage or a particular kind of marriage. But it's not what the vast majority of Americans are saying is actually motivating them to get married. So that's partly why I left it out. It doesn't turn up in the research as a huge reason that people are saying they get married. And I didn't go into the reasons why people oppose same-sex marriage, which I think are very different from the reasons people choose to get married. So that's a different talk. But the religion would certainly come up there. Yes.
How does the American model compare with other societies that have, say, a high divorce rate versus a low one?
That is a broad question that I don't think I can answer. Yeah, my research has almost exclusively focused on the U.S., so I know about examples of how marriage has been constructed differently in other cultures, but I haven't tracked the research on divorce rates globally or anything like that. So. Apologize.
I saw a brief flash of the website Against Equality, which I personally am a fan of, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So I saw that I was running out of time, so I skipped by it, but thanks, Michelle. So there is a segment of the population, and particularly the GLBT community, that's fighting for inclusion in this institution of marriage. But there are also segments of that population that do not believe that that is where the fight should be. And actually, Michelle was the one that made me aware of this particular organization, which is Against Equality. And from what I've gathered from looking at it, their argument is really that we should be extending the rights and privileges of marriage to people who don't want to engage in that institution, rather than broadening the institution and allowing more people to participate in it. And I guess I have mixed feelings about that, because I think it's so much harder to change the cultural weight that the institution of marriage has. Expanding it to more populations seems a lot easier than changing that cultural weight. But obviously, I also believe we should afford that cultural weight to other forms of relationships and families too. So I think it addresses many of the people who think marriage is a cure for social ills. Have a lot of evidence on their side, but that's partly because we think marriage cures social ills, right? Why are married people happier than people who make lifelong commitments to each other that aren't marriage? It's because their communities and their culture support that relationship more. That doesn't answer, you didn't really ask a question, but do you have anything else you want to say about that?
No more questions? So let's give another round of applause to Rachel.